Welcome back to Ladies of Another View on Beck. We're going to follow up a little bit on that last segment. We're going to touch a little bit more on in segment 4. But before we do that, I want you to meet Julia and Mirek Petrovic. They are from Rugby, North Dakota, but he is from the Czech Republic and she is from Russia. Julia and Merrick, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much for having us.
Thank you for having us. Yeah.
So you guys have been living in Rugby for a while, but you were brought to our attention because you had sent a letter to Senator Kramer. Why don't you first tell us a little bit about your background and your history from over in the Russia and Czech area?
Okay.
Well, yeah, I can start. So, I was born and I grew up in Czech Republic, and it used to be called Czechoslovakia. So, like many countries in Eastern Europe, it was a communist country that was part of the Eastern Bloc, and that all ended when I was about 14 years old. And when I was 19, I came to the United States of America and became a permanent resident, naturalized United States citizen later on.
So Julia, why don't you tell us how you came to America or how you arrived in America?
Mm-hmm. So I was born and grew up, well, actually, I was born in Soviet Union, grew up half of my life in the Soviet Union, part of it in Russia. And my mom is Ukrainian. She's from the eastern parts of Ukraine. My dad is Russian. So it's really hard for me to pick and choose what am I, a Russian or a Ukrainian. And in 1996, I came to United States for the first time as a cultural exchange student. And then in 1998, I came since 1998, I've been living in America. I'm also a naturalized citizen. And America's our home now with Merrick because that's where our family is and that's where we raise our 5 children.
Great. Now, did you meet in America then, or did you meet in Russia?
Yeah.
In America?
We did. We met in a town in New Jersey. It's called Hackettstown. So that's where the summer camp was.
Well, why don't we get right to the letter? You had written a letter to Senator Kramer. Mirek, why don't you tell us about that? Tell us what drove you to write that letter.
I heard Senator Kramer talk on CNBC about how the United States needs to send more lethal aid and more advanced weapons to Ukraine. And, for the last 8 years since 2014, when Ukraine went through a kind of a revolution and a coup where the elected government was overthrown. I know that a lot of people talk to me and were asking me my opinion on the situation. And so I know that a lot of people don't know what is really happening in Ukraine, what has happened over there, why is there civil war, and where it stems from. So history is a big interest of mine, and I read up a lot about, growing up in communism and going through the economic downfall from the early 90s. I was very interested in, how things kind of evolve over there. So that's why I reacted to his interview over there. And I don't believe that the United States should be sending any weapons or aid to Ukraine right now, except humanitarian aid for all the displaced people. And I think that we should be talking to the Russians and we should find a solution because this situation is partly our fault.
Okay, so I have part of the letter. I have a quote from the letter. Let's pull that first one up. I have been horrified in recent years at U.S. foreign policy towards Ukraine, Russia, and Eastern Europe in general. But you went on to say that the regime change had been achieved with the help of neo-Nazi gangs. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the neo-Nazis?
Well, when we talk about neo-Nazis in Ukraine, you have to understand that it's not like here in America, if we don't agree with somebody, we'll call them a Nazi, or if they are more of a conservative. Trump was a Nazi. Everybody's a Nazi. With them, with more of a liberal portion of our population doesn't agree with somebody. But in Ukraine has a history of collaboration with Nazis. And in the 90s, when communism ended, Ukraine was very poor. It still is the poorest country in Europe. So the recruitment into these skinhead neo-Nazi gangs was fairly successful over there. We had the same thing happening in Czech when I was growing up. And countries like Czech and Poland managed to pull themselves out of that situation. The economic situation is a lot better over there, but it didn't happen in Ukraine. I guess we should visit a little bit on. I have a map over here I would like to show you, just to understand, what happened in 2014. This is a map of Ukraine over here.
I don't know if we'll be able to see it real well, but okay, go ahead. Yep,
there you
that's
go.
really good.
If you look over here on the blue area is the Russian-speaking population of Ukraine, and this area was given to Ukraine in 1922 by Lenin. And Crimea, here is Crimea right down here, and that was given to Ukraine by Khrushchev in 1954. So these areas in Ukraine were not really kind of a Ukrainian area, and they became part of Ukraine within the framework of Soviet Union. When Soviet Union fell apart, a lot of Russian-speaking people found themselves being part of a country that they didn't really have any cultural ties with. So in 2014, Ukrainian President Yanukovych, who is a Russian-speaking president who was heavily supported by the Russian-speaking Eastern population, rejected a EU treaty with, it was a trade agreement that he didn't believe was good for Ukraine, and that sparked protests in Kyiv, and it drew a lot of people. A lot of people came over there. One group of people was fighting the government. The other group of people was trying to protect the government. The anti-government forces eventually won, and it was with the help of these neo-Nazi gangs, because they were not afraid to use all kinds of violent tactics. So the democratically elected government of Yanukovych, and we can think whatever we want about him, there was a lot of talk about him being corrupt. So he was deposed. He fled to Russia, and the protesters, they stormed the parliament, and a new government was formed. But the government that was formed over there, it wasn't some kind of a grassroots government. The United States State Department has spent $5 billion to get regime change in Kyiv. We have Victoria Nuland. I don't know if you guys are familiar with her, and she was the Undersecretary of State, also known as the Cookie Lady of Kyiv. She was supporting these groups that were fighting the democratically elected government over there. And it all came to light because somebody published these tapes of recorded telephone conversations between her and the then ambassador of the United States to Kyiv, where they were talking about that once we overthrow him, we're going to have Yatsenyuk as a prime minister, and this guy's going to be that kind of minister. So they basically picked the new government and there was a lot of people talking about it, but it never made mainstream news.
We were kind of talking a little bit about the different invasions and the neo-Nazis. Just go ahead, pick up where you left off.
Yeah, so they boasted. There was an interview with one of their leaders talking about the coup in Kyiv, and he said, if it wasn't for us, we were only 10%, but he said we did 90% of the fighting. And the fighting turned deadly. There were sniper attacks. Nobody knows who provoked them, but eventually a lot of people died and were killed in Kiev during those protests. So when they sacked the parliament, the eastern Ukrainians started fleeing. They got back into their buses and they were driving back to the eastern provinces of Lugansk, Donetsk, Kharkov, and Mariupol, where right now we have all these fights, where all these crazy images are coming from. And of course, also to Crimea. There was a lot of people from Crimea coming over there. And one of the first things that the new government did is they outlawed a Russian language. So the whole eastern part of Ukraine speaks Russian. And they outlawed the Russian language as the official language. And, for a lot of older people and I mean, that is a big problem, and it's a violation.
It's an existential problem.
It's an existential problem. It's a violation of human rights. We supported a lot of different, like Kosovo and other countries. We supported independence for people over there. I wanted to say something about Crimea because since 2014, we were hearing about a Russian invasion. And it was probably the nicest invasion ever, I would say, by any country. I read the history of Crimea, and since 1991, when they became part of Ukraine, when Soviet Union fell apart, they were an independent republic within the framework of Ukraine. They had their own parliament. They had their own passports, which was a problem for the Ukrainian government, Kiev. They had their own passports. They had double citizenship with Russia. And they tried on numerous occasions to leave Ukraine and rejoin Russia. So, a lot of people don't know that Russia had troops under a treaty with Ukraine in Sevastopol because it's their biggest naval base, which was built over there under or during the Soviet times. So they were allowed to have about 25,000 troops over there. They only had 16,000. So they never brought any troops over. People voted to become part of Russia. And we got this hysteria over here. Putin invaded Ukraine. Putin invaded Ukraine. You could hear it everywhere for, years to come. And that's when we started putting sanctions on Russia. And sanctions, of course, are, declaration of war, basically, because the economic wars tend to lead to real wars. And that's how this whole thing started. And then these two regions, Donbas and Lugansk, separated. They said, we're not going to have none of this anti-Russian rhetoric from Kyiv. So they started protests and they started taking over government buildings. And Ukraine sent the army in there. So then they started arming themselves. And you had civil war in the East for 8 years. And it's still going on by. So that's...
So can you explain a little bit for our viewers, because, as they follow this history that you're giving them, how did this quote-unquote neo-Nazi group form? It's not like the Crips and the Bloods in California or Black Lives Matter in Chicago or D.C. It's not that kind of gang, am I correct?
No. They were in... They might have started like that in the 90s, but by the time the coup in 2014 came about, they already had a few political parties like the right sector, Pravi sector, and others, and they got places in parliament. So they already had power in the parliament, and these militias that helped to facilitate the coup started organizing themselves, and they left as volunteers, or they went as volunteers to fight the Russian separatists, so the Eastern Ukrainian separatists, the Russian-speaking population. And I'm sure that a lot of people heard about the Azov battalion, and the Aidar, and the Donbas battalion. And in the beginning, they were just volunteers, and they were actually, and this is really bizarre, because a lot of people can't wrap their head around Zelensky, President Zelensky, is Jewish, and this oligarch who supported these battalions and bought them weapons, his name is Igor Kolomoisky, and they're all tied together. But it seemed like Mr. Kolomoisky didn't care about who these guys are. He was just a hired muscle. And he has big business interests in Donbass and Lugansk. So he wanted, when his revenue stopped coming from over there, that was kind of a problem for him. And it just grew from that point on. Now, these battalions, eventually, the parliament voted to incorporate them into Ukrainian army. And their members went into officer schools. And during these last 8 years, they penetrated basically into a lot of places in Ukrainian army.
So when you wrote the letter to Senator Kramer, with everything that you laid out as far as history, I'm assuming at that level our government officials know this history, but it makes me wonder sometimes, why are we pushing so hard to defend Ukraine then if Russia is actually protecting the people on the eastern border from the advancement of the Western ideology into those provinces, or is it provinces, countries, I don't know what you call them. But am I kind of on target there? Or where did you want Senator Kramer to go in his thoughts of this?
I think you are on target over there. Russia wasn't happy with the expansion of NATO eastward, and they weren't happy with us sending weapons to the Ukrainian army, which was being used out east, when they worked really hard to get these Minsk agreements into place, but they were never implemented. Not even a little bit. There was shelling going on every day for 8 years. So, and yes, the people in Donbass and Lugansk, they fought back, but this is something that it should have been taken care of. Instead of screaming Russian invasion, I believe we should have talked to the Russians, and I think that people in the eastern part suffered for 8 years, and now more people are going to suffer because of different interests that I believe some corrupt officials in our government have. From the point, this is just my opinion, Victoria Nuland and her husband is a known neocon. He was a founding member for the Project for New American Century. If you read their documents, they talk about that United States is supposed to have hegemony over all natural resources and energy resources in the Middle East, and of course Russia is the big exporter.
Why don't you kind of give us your point of view as to why now? What's going on? Why is this happening? And whose side should we be on?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question, because I have been asking this kind of question since 1914, when we saw what was happening in Ukraine, the start of the civil war. Then for 8 straight years, people that lived in the eastern parts of Ukraine were just ignored by the world. It was not reported as much as now what had been happening to them for those 8 years. There were 2 documentaries that I am aware of that have been made in 2016. A French reporter was invited by a Ukrainian man from the eastern part, and she came and she documented it. You're free to just go on YouTube and put it in search. I'm sure it will show up. So that documentary shows the destruction and shelling and bombing of Ukrainian people on the eastern part by Ukrainian people from the western part of Ukraine. We talk about 16,000 deaths so far since 2014. We're talking about 100,000 people misplaced. Most of them fled to Russia. Most of them were given Russian citizenship passports and money. Those people that stayed on the eastern part of Ukraine, those people that have been suffering for 8 years, and only now the world has woken up to what has happened to them. So their suffering, for some reason, meant nothing them losing their pensions, schools being bombed, hospitals being bombed, that all had happened in the eastern part of Ukraine since 2014. And I happen to have a family in the eastern part of Ukraine, and luckily we were able to keep in touch with them. That it's not it's a distant family, it's a third cousins over there. But when I was asking them a question, they were telling me that the first time in 8 years that they woke up and there was no shelling in their part of the country.
That's incredible.
Wow.
Yep.
So how do we tell people here in the United States what is actually happening there versus what they're seeing on the alphabet networks?
Right.
It's very difficult for them to get their head wrapped around it because they're just plain choosing sides. Everybody's holding up the Ukrainian flag because we don't want to be desensitive to the people that are losing their lives and their livelihoods.
Right. And I'm not denying that, the war is real, the suffering is real. Now it's just the turn of people from the Western Ukraine to suffer as well. So they pretty much joined the Eastern Ukrainians in their path of suffering, right? And the reason why Merrick and we decided to come and speak with you guys, because it really became a concern to us, the one-sided coverage of the conflict, and not giving the other side of the conflict an opportunity to speak, to show, to explain. Even if you don't care to know much about what is going on in other parts of the world, which I wouldn't know, why wouldn't you want to know? I think it's exciting. Because whatever's happening elsewhere in the world actually affects us. So we can't pretend like it doesn't affect us. But so we saw that the one-sided coverage of the conflict will be damaging, right? Because the facts are not being presented. It's all emotions. It's all the bombed buildings, which it is happening in other parts of Ukraine right now, just it had been happening in eastern part of Ukraine since 2014. So both Mirek and we get our news from alternative American media. We watch Russian media, we watch Czech media. That's why I think it allows us to put more pieces of a puzzle to what's not really being told to the rest of the people, to see a broader view of what's really happening. Why is it happening? Could it have been prevented? And what needs to be done for it to stop?
Right. And it just seems, I don't believe in coincidence, and I'm just going to throw this out there, and we don't even need to discuss it probably, but we heard of all the corruption and the fraud and the whole thing with Hunter Biden and Joe Biden and the Ukrainian peace and Burisma and all the things. We were hearing about that before the last election. And now all of a sudden, there's the Ukrainian conflict that's number one on TV. COVID went away overnight, and now it's all Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. And that just leads me to wonder, what part of all of that corruption that is now being buried again plays in all of this? Why now? Why is this happening now?
Well, maybe because it is getting buried in all these war news, and you're seeing images that there's a lot of destruction going. This is a fairly big war, but it's mostly happening in east over there. They have a number of cities encircled over by the Russian army, but we are seeing some crazy images over here, and nobody is asking anymore why did we fund biolabs in Ukraine? What happened to Hunter Biden? Now his laptop is all of a sudden that's real news. It was hidden for 4 years, so for 3 years they were pretending like that was just. Again, they had their specialists, intelligence specialists agree. Everybody agreed.
The experts.
Yeah. So yeah, and the real question is, are we gonna do anything? Is the United States gonna do anything to stop whatever is happening in Ukraine. How far are we willing to go? Because I believe that Zelensky is not a president who has power over anything over there. He ran on a platform of stopping the war. He said, no, we need peace in the East. I'm going to stop the war. And there are videos of him when he came to talk to the generals out. They told him, no, they told him to get lost. So he has no power over his own armed forces. And this is where the biggest fighting is. The city of Mariupol, where we see so much destruction over there, is in the hands of this Azov battalion. So I have watched a lot of interviews with people fleeing the city, and they're talking about being held in the basements. Of course, in our media, it's all turned around, and yeah, I would urge people to really start looking deeper into it. Don't ride on your emotions. We have to think about this situation clearly, because if we are to live on this planet in peace and in health, then we should learn how to live with the Russians and the Ukrainians and Germany, and we can't allow people like Victoria Nuland to just go and spend our money to get someone in there who she believes is going to be pro-American, and as a byproduct of that, we get a whole civil war in a country that's next to Russia, which is a nuclear power, and they eventually are going to say this situation is unbearable for us, and that's when the invasion happens. So no excuses for anybody. It's a sad situation, and I just would like to say that the founding fathers of this country were geniuses when they said, because they knew a lot about European politics and European wars, when they said no foreign entanglements. And I think if we would just let's meditate on this for a while, and I think it would do us a whole lot of good.
Yes. All right.
Amen.
Well, I want to thank you both for coming on today. We really appreciate the inside information, or just kind of an update with another point of view, and that's what we're here for, another view. And but stop in and see us again sometime, for an update.
Great.
Thank you.